All right, in our final lecture of the week, we're going to talk about the hormonal regulation of female reproductive cycles. So the hormones that are involved here are obviously most front of mind are the estrogens. These help promote the development of female reproductive structures and secondary sex characteristics like the breast. The key secondary sex characteristics involve the distribution of adipose tissue in the breast, abdomen, the mons pubis, like we talked about, the hips, alterations to voice pitch, broader pelvis than males, and hair growth in certain areas. We also see increased protein anabolism, including the building of strong bones. In this regard, estrogens are kind of like, I guess you could consider them to be synergistic with human growth hormone. They are associated with lower blood cholesterol, so women under 50 have a much lower risk of heart disease than males of the same age. Every month after menstruation, estrogen stimulates the stratum basalis to regenerate the stratum functionalis. That's the part that gets sloughed off, right, at the end of every cycle. And at moderate levels, and very importantly to the story that we're talking about here, at moderate levels, middling levels of estrogen, you are able to activate this GnRH, FSH, LH axis. But at high levels of estrogen, it actually inhibits this pathway, as you're going to see. This is really central to the story. Another female reproductive hormone is progesterone. This is secreted mainly by cells of the corpus luteum, which, remember, is that tissue that's left over following the ovulation of the secondary oocyte. Endometrial repair, so it cooperates with estrogen to repair the endometrium and make it ready for implantation. Preparation of mammary glands for milk secretion to provide to the child. And high levels of progesterone will inhibit GnRH and LH, much like the estrogen does. Relaxin is another hormone that's associated with the female reproductive system. It's produced in small amounts by the corpus luteum. Its job is to relax the uterus by inhibiting contractions of the myometrium. It is thought that implantation of a fertilized egg actually occurs more readily in a quiet, quote-unquote, quiet uterus, which is not contractile. In terms of pregnancy, the placenta will start producing a lot of relaxin, and at the end of pregnancy, the relaxin will serve to increase the flexibility of the pubic symphysis so it can stretch to accommodate the baby being delivered, and also for the same reason dilate the uterine cervix. Obviously, both of these things are used to speed up the delivery process. The final hormone I want to talk about is the inhibin, which is secreted by granulosa cells of growing follicles and prior to ovulation and after ovulation by the corpus luteum. And its job is to inhibit secretion of FSH and to a lesser extent LH as well. It's really hard to talk about the female reproductive cycle, but the way I've found it the easiest is to break it up into actual two cycles. So there's an ovarian cycle, which we'll talk about momentarily, and then there's also a uterine cycle as well. And combine them together is how you get the female reproductive cycle. So they're really, when we talk about the uterine cycle, there are really three parts of the uterine cycle. The first, well, depending on where you start, it's a cycle. Let's just say starting first, we have the menstrual phase, in which you see the sloughing off of the stratum functionalis. Here you can see the stratum functionalis breaking off into these fragments, which is causing the endometrium to slip back into its stratum basalis region. The reason that the sloughing off of the uterus, the stratum functionalis of the uterus occurs is because there's no estrogen or progesterone being produced once the corpus luteum dies. So this actually has to do with the hormones produced in the ovarian cycle, as with all of these events. The second phase of the uterine cycle is called the proliferative phase, and this is due to estrogens in high amounts. So estrogens, and remember the estrogens are coming from the follicle, so as the follicle gets bigger, you're going to get more and more of these estrogens. The function of estrogen in general is to cause the endometrium to repair itself. The stratum basal is going to undergo, well, it's going to go lots and lots of cell division, produce a new stratum functionalis, and in fact, what you see in this proliferative stage is that the uterus or the stratum functionalis is growing like double in size. You also at this time start to see the development of the short and straight endometrial glands, and the arterioles are going to start coiling and lengthening as they penetrate the stratum functionalis. This is all when estrogen is present. When it's estrogen and progesterone being present, you enter into what's called the secretory phase. The secretory phase involves growth and coiling of the endometrial glands, vascularization of the superficial endometrium, the thickening of the endometrium. It actually almost doubles again. And the reason it's actually called the secretory phase is because during this phase, those endometrial glands start to become active, and they're starting to secrete into the lumen glycogen. And so that's where it gets its name, the secretory phase. The ovarian cycle is a little bit more complicated, but it can also, too, be broken down into a menstrual phase, a pre-ovulatory phase, and a post-ovulatory phase. The pre-ovulatory phase is what initiates the development of primary follicles into the secondary phase, into the secondary follicle. By 6 days, so almost a week, one of the secondary follicles will become dominant and start secreting a large amount of estrogens. So we start with our primary follicles here, one of which is going to start becoming dominant, and it's going to start secreting a whole bunch of estrogen, and it's going to get our estrogen levels to a high concentration. This is the follicle that will become the mature follicle and eventually ovulate. Obviously, then that ovulates, which expels the oocyte into the fallopian tube, which leaves you with this endocrine structure called the corpus luteum, which has a finite lifespan and eventually degenerates into the corpus albicans. Before it degenerates, the corpus luteum is secreting estrogen, progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin, all those enzymes that we hormones that we talked about before. So that defines the post-ovulatory phase. So the menstrual phase, you have no hormonal signal at all. The pre-ovulatory phase, the signal is estrogen coming from the growing follicle. And the post-ovulatory phase, you get estrogen, progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin from the corpus luteum. Once the corpus luteum degenerates into the corpus albicans, no hormones are being secreted, and that's what causes the onset of the menstrual phase. Now, the real trick to understanding the female reproductive cycle is to realize 2 points about estrogen. The high amounts of estrogen produced by the growing follicle, so the follicle starts producing an increasing amount of estrogen. That high level of estrogen produced by the follicle is going to go to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus and cause it to release more of the GnRH, the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which will, as you recall from 1160, target the anterior pituitary and cause it to make more follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, FSH and LH. So estrogen activates FSH and LH in two ways. One, by activating the hypothalamus and causing it to release GnRH, and two, by talking to the anterior pituitary directly and causing them to release FSH and LH as well. The consequence of FSH and LH action causes the follicle to grow more. Okay, so as the follicle grows more, what is it going to do? It's going to produce more estrogen. What is that higher level of estrogen going to do? Well, it's going to go back to the pituitary and the hypothalamus and make more FSH and LH, which will make the follicle grow even more, which will make it have more estrogen. This is your classic positive feedback loop. Hopefully you can see that. However, after ovulation occurs, and you are now with the corpus luteum, you are not producing a high amount of estrogen. You're producing a medium amount of estrogen, along with progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin. The result of these hormones, particularly inhibin and this middling amount of estrogen, is that they actually go back and inhibit the anterior pituitary from producing FSH and LH, and they go back to the hypothalamus and inhibit the production of GnRH. So this is a very odd pathway, and the real secret is that the high levels of estrogen that you would see in the follicle during the pre-ovulatory stage leads to a positive feedback loop in which GnRH, FSH, and LH are producing more estrogen, which will then go back and produce more GnRH, FSH, and LH. The medium amounts of estrogen that signify the post-ovulatory phase, so those hormones that are released by the corpus luteum, in particular that medium amount of estrogen, as well as the progesterone and the inhibin, are going to inhibit GnRH, FSH, and LH production. Why? Because we don't want to grow another follicle at this point. We're waiting to see if the oocyte developed in that follicle is going to get fertilized or not, and we're going to give a couple weeks time for that to happen. Once it doesn't happen, then we go back and try the cycle again. So this is just another slide to review the points that I'm talking about here. Again, we have this axis in the hypothalamus, the GnRH, which is triggering the anterior pituitary to produce LH. The GnRH starts occurring in bursts around the onset of puberty. So at puberty, you're going to get bursts of GnRH and bursts of FSH and LH. FSH is going to stimulate follicles to initially develop. So we're going to start growing follicles because of FSH. That's an easy way to remember the name FSH. Luteinizing hormone is going to trigger ovulation. And obviously with ovulation, you lead to the production of the corpus luteum. But of course, FSH is also going to stimulate ovulation by helping grow those follicles. So this down here summarizes some of the functions here. So estrogens promote development and maintenance of female reproductive structures, feminine secondary sex characteristics in breasts, increase protein anabolism, lower blood cholesterol, and moderate levels actually inhibit GnRH, FSH, and LH. I would add that high levels actually activate GnRH, FSH, and LH. Progesterone works with estrogens to prepare the endometrium for implantation, prepares the mammary glands to secrete milk, and also inhibits LH and GnRH. Relaxin inhibits contractions of smooth muscle to make implantation easier. They relax the muscles even further, increase the flexibility of the pubic symphysis and dilate the uterine cervix during labor. And then finally, inhibin also inhibits the release of FSH and to a lesser extent, LH. So basically, estrogens in the bloodstream provided by the growing follicles of the ovary are what stimulates the repair of the endometrium. And just to show you where we are here, again, there's the stratum basalis, there's the stratum functionalis. Collectively, they both make up the endometrium, and then surrounding that is the myometrium, and then finally the parametrium. Cells of the stratum basal, or the stratum basalis down here, undergo mitosis and produce a new stratum functionalis. And that will cause this to get thicker. The endometrium is going to get thicker, and as they get thicker, you're going to start seeing these short, straight endometrial glands develop. The arterioles are going to coil as they penetrate the stratum functionalis. This is going to, as I said in the couple slides ago, this is going to double the thickness of the endometrium to, just to put into perspective, maybe about a centimeter or so. And this proliferative phase corresponds to, as I said, the pre-ovulatory phase of the ovarian cycle, which corresponds to high levels of estrogen. Once you get to the post-ovulatory phase, the progesterones and the estrogens provided by now the corpus luteum, which is the endocrine structure, are going to promote growth and coiling of the endometrial glands. So you can start seeing the coiling and how much larger the glands are. There's going to be significant increase to the vascularization of the superficial endometrium. And there's going to be a thickening of the endometrium to about 2 centimeters. During this time, the endometrial glands are going to be secreting glycogen, which are going to nourish the embryo when it is in the uterus at the start. And these changes all happen about a week after ovulation. Now, if fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum will degenerate and the hormones required for maintaining this structure are going to go away, and that's going to cause menstruation. If fertilization does occur, the corpus luteum, as we're going to see in a couple weeks' time, is temporarily rescued to maintain its functionality for a little bit longer until the placenta can become developed and take over the role of that hormone production. So menstrual flow then consists of, well, first of all, a lot of blood, 100 milliliters of blood, tissue fluid, mucus, and mostly just dead epithelial cells from the stratum functionalis. All of these are coming from the endometrium. The cause of this, as I've said, is basically the decline or absence of estrogen and progesterone levels that are caused by the degeneration of the corpus luteum. And once that estrogen and progesterone signal goes away and the corpus luteum degenerates, those cells are dying, and they're going to do what our cells do when they're injured. They're going to release prostaglandins. Cells are going to become oxygen deprived and die because the blood vessels can no longer supply it. The endometrium is going to shrink, go from 2 centimeters to maybe half a centimeter. And all of this material has to go somewhere, so it's going to flow from the uterine cavity through the vagina to the outside of the body. So just to go through the ovarian cycle here, this is referring to the menstrual and pre-ovulatory phase. What happens is one of the follicles, like this guy right here, is going to be marked to become the mature follicle. This follicle is going to do its job, which is to produce large amounts of estrogen. This estrogen is going to do a couple things. One, we already know what it's going to do with regards to GnRH, FSH, and LH, but another thing that it does is it goes and inhibits other follicles from developing. So only one, in theory, follicle should get a chance to ovulate each cycle for each ovary. The mature follicle is marked by production of huge amounts of estrogen. That really is the key. And yes, it inhibits the follicles, but the real story we want to focus on is activating this GnRH, FSH, and LH axis. So at mid-cycle, what you end up getting is this surge of luteinizing hormone. This is due to that positive feedback loop, right? Where you have the GnRH producing the LH, which is going to the follicle, causing it to grow more, to produce more estrogen, which in turn is going to activate more LH, either directly or through GnRH. So you end up getting this positive feedback loop, and eventually, as you know with the positive feedback loop, eventually something explodes. So this is about day 14 of a 28-day cycle. During ovulation, what you see, again, the oocyte, as it's expelled into the fallopian tube, is still surrounded by its zona pellucida and corona radiata. But the key here is that positive feedback loop. So first, you get a high concentration of estrogens, which stimulate GnRH and LH to be produced. The LH will cause the follicle to grow more, and eventually, as this positive feedback loop causes increasing size and pressure on the system, the luteinizing hormone is going to cause the rupturing of the mature follicle, and hence, of course, the expulsion of the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. So that is how the secondary oocyte, the zona pellucida, and the corona radiata actually get into the uterine tube. After ovulation, the mature follicle collapses, like the whole thing is just broken down, which does cause some minor bleeding, and a clot will form. Once this happens, the mature follicle is temporarily referred to as the corpus hemorrhagicum. I'm not even sure I can spell that. Basically, what you get is this is a mixture of theca internal cells with granulosa cells, and then eventually they get clumped together and give rise to the corpus luteum. This is all done because of luteinizing hormone. That's why it's called luteinizing hormone, because it favors the luteinization of the follicle. And again, the function of the corpus luteum is to produce progesterone, estrogen, relaxin, and inhibin. And these luteal cells that are within there will actually also absorb the blood clot that was formed from the breakdown of the follicle. So this is the ovarian cycle over a 28-day period. Now, I know there's other cycles, but we're just going to focus on this one because that's what the figures in the textbook did. So we can start anywhere, but really let's start at the beginning, stage 0 in the menstrual phase. We have, because of the end of the last stage cycle, we have basically no estrogen and no progesterone. But as a result of that, the estrogen and progesterone, which were inhibiting FSH and LH production, are now gone. And so at the start, you're going to start to see FSH and LH levels rise in a positive feedback sense. So you'll notice, like right before day ovulation here, there's a spike in FSH and there's a large spike in LH. Now remember what FSH and LH are doing, right? Is that they are helping to grow the follicle And the follicle, as it gets bigger, is going to be producing an increasing amount of estrogen. So this green dotted line is showing you that as you get close to ovulation, you have a high amount of estrogen too. So around day 14, we are seeing a large amount of luteinizing hormone, a large amount of follicle stimulating hormone, and a very high level of estrogen. And the consequence of all of this, with this positive feedback loop that goes along with it, is that ovulation is going to occur here. And now we have, instead of a follicle acting as the hormone producing structure, we now have the corpus luteum acting as a hormone producing structure. And remember, the corpus luteum, in addition to estrogen, is also producing progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin. Most of these also will go and inhibit FSH and LH. So what you see here is, first of all, after the mature follicle dies, you're going to see a drop in estrogen levels, but that's going to be rescued by the corpus luteum. So you get this kind of middling levels or middle levels of estrogen. We also see, for the first time, progesterone become available. But you also see, with regards to LH and FSH, is that they basically drop down to nothing because they're getting inhibited by the progesterone and the estrogen. Now, the point at which this all changes and the FSH and the LH start going up again is the point at which the corpus luteum degenerates. And that will remove the estrogen and progesterone, which will remove the inhibitory signal for the LH and the FSH, and the cycle will start again. Okay. So again, you have the pre-ovulatory phase, the post-ovulatory phase, and the menstrual phase. And in the ovarian cycle, what that's referring to is, in the pre-ovulatory phase, you have the primary endocrine structure is the follicle itself, which is producing large amounts of estrogen that will ultimately cause the ovulation to occur. Post-ovulatory, the endocrine structure is the corpus luteum, which is secreting a middling amount of estrogen, progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin. That ultimately will degenerate, will leaving you with no endocrine structure, which will cause the menstruation to occur. So the key here then, once you understand the ovarian cycle, is then to link the events of the ovarian cycle to the events of the uterine cycle, which hopefully I've been trying to do. So in the menstruation stage, the menstruation part of the the uterine cycle, it corresponds to the menstrual phase of the ovarian cycle. There's no hormone. But it also will allow the FSH to LH and LH to start being active, which will put you into the proliferative phase, because as the follicles start developing, you're going to get more estrogen, which is going to help proliferate the stratum functionalis. After ovulation, you're going to again see the rupturing of the mature follicle, and now the corpus luteum takes over, starts producing inhibitory levels of estrogen as well as progesterone, which is going to A, grow the stratum functionalis further, and B, cause the glands and the blood vessels in serving the stratum functionalis to become functional and active, and now we enter into our secretory phase. Once the corpus luteum degenerates into the corpus albicans, we're no longer producing any hormone, and menstruation will occur. All right. So again, just to look specifically at the three phases of the uterine cycle, the menstrual phase of the uterine cycle corresponds to the presence of the corpus albicans. The proliferative phase of the menstrual cycle corresponds to the estrogen-rich environment produced from the growing follicles. And the secretory phase is generated by the estrogens and progesterones produced from the corpus luteum. Okay, so that's a pretty complicated story. It's one of those big stories for the term, as I like to say, and so I'm happy to talk this out with you in more detail at another time. All right, I'll see you next week. Happy studying.